Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm so glad to have you here and to be back for another webinar series. It's so great for you to be here and for us to be here today for high quality instructional materials in social studies. I'm your host, Martin Andrews, Creative Director at Inquire Ed. And today's webinar is the first in our fall series presented by the National Council for the Social Studies and Inquire Ed. Our next session, Implementing Elementary Social Studies Across a District, brings together district leaders for a practical conversation about what it really takes to make high-quality social studies work at scale, from building teacher capacity to the stages of implementation. Then we're going to shift from systems to classrooms with a day in the life inquiry in a fifth grade social studies classroom. You'll get to see inquiry in action, how a lesson unfolds from start to finish, and how students build and apply their knowledge in meaningful ways. I hope you'll join us for both. They are going to be great. As I mentioned, this series is brought to you by the National Council for the Social Studies and Inquire Ed. And if you're planning ahead, the NCSS conference is coming up December 5th through the 7th in Washington, D.C. It's always an inspiring event. I will be there, Inquire Ed will be there, and so will a whole lot of your social studies colleagues. So advanced registration is open through November 26th. Be sure to lock in your spot. The series is also presented by Inquire Ed. Inquire Ed supports teachers with high-quality instructional materials that make joyful, rigorous, and transferable learning possible for every student. Our elementary social studies curriculum, Inquiry Journeys, is used across the country to help students build deep content knowledge and develop the inquiry skills essential for a thriving democracy. You can find out more at inquireed.com, or you can scan the QR code, reach out. We'd love to chat about social studies and inquiry-based learning. Before I bring on our panelists, I would love to hear from you in the chat. So we're talking today about high quality instructional materials in social studies. So you've already fired up the chat. Here's a question for you that you can put in there, and then we'll bring our panelists on. When you think of high quality social studies materials, what comes to mind? What does that look like for you? What's involved in that? What's a part of high quality social studies materials in your conception as you know it right now? So share primary sources, Stacy says, active learning with critical thinking, primary sources, primary sources, primary sources. Great, keep those coming. And now I would love for Shanti and Elizabeth to join us. To help us explore and dig in. Shanti is the CEO and founder of Inquire Ed, and Elizabeth is the Chief Academic Officer and co-founder. And you can see Shanti and Elizabeth, if you're looking at that chat that's blowing up, that people have a lot of ideas about what constitutes high quality instructional materials. And many of them are ones that we hold as well and went into the creation of this curriculum review guide. And I want to start, Shanti, with you and ask you and have you tell us a little bit about what went into the revision of the review guide and why focus on high quality instructional materials in the first place.
So I'm going to start with just like kind of a little bit of history on the high quality instructional materials movement. A lot of this, I think, is probably well known by the folks on this webinar today. But just to like make sure we're all operating from the same space. So HQIM, first of all, stands for high quality instructional materials. Has really started in more the ELA math space, science space, and in those subject areas, we have organizations like EdReports. But since EdReports started, now there are lots of other organizations and a lot of states doing this work to really assess, is something a high quality instructional material? Like, why high quality instructional materials? Like, just like, let's go back to that before we like really dive into what they are, and especially in social studies. So when we think about the value and impact that high quality instructional materials have, like we all remember kind of this average teacher that we all had them along the way. And we also remembered what it looked like when we had a highly skilled teacher. Quite a difference in experience. I remember in my own classroom, in my own like experience as a student. And imagine if we could make every average teacher that highly skilled teacher. That's what the research tells us that high quality instructional materials have the ability to do. And that's why we're talking so much about them. That's why the education space talks so much about them. But isn't HQIM the same thing as curriculum? Doesn't it seem like we just kind of like came up with a fancy word? No, they are actually not the same. Curriculum, as we think about it, like in kind of the way that we had them as, kids in our classrooms, right? The textbook was a textbook. That textbook could be online. That textbook, when we were kids, it was not online. There was a workbook probably. Professional development was for teachers was mainly about onboarding if there was anything, and then a teacher guide was often optional. But even more so than that, I think it's important to like dive into like how these other subject areas are really defining high quality instructional materials. So this comes from the US Department of Education. Standards aligned, content rich instructional tools that provide a coherent scope and sequence for grade level academic content. HQIM provides a full suite of resources for teachers, students, and families, including lesson plans, instructional units, and embedded formative assessments. HQIM will utilize evidence-based instructional strategies and provide implementation supports for educators to ensure the learning needs of all students are met. I gotta say that's like a really high bar. That HQIM, when we're talking about the difference of between just any old curriculum and HQIM, there is a very big difference, and the bar is really set high. And so there's quite a bit we need to do to like really evaluate what that looks like. And so that brought us to back in several years ago. I think it's on this next slide. I can't remember what year it was now. Really thinking about what does this look like in social studies? We saw this gap in the space, really. So, Ed Reports and other organizations weren't really doing this and in social studies. And we heard from districts that we'd been working with, states that we'd been working with, there was just kind of this like, how are you all thinking about how you're making your curriculum high quality? What does that look like for you all? We had been really looking at ELA and math and science as a model for high quality instructional materials, had examined their rubrics pretty deeply and thought about what applies for social studies and what is different in social studies. And so we came up with what we called the Social Studies Curriculum Review Guide. So our first version was published in 2020. I knew that year was on here. And like we said, kind of saw that gap in a definition for high quality instructional materials and thought, we're doing a lot of work internally to think about this. So let's go ahead and just like give that to folks and see if it's helpful for them. I gotta say, when we first talked about that in 2020, I think it was in the end of 2019, and how much impact it's had, I have been shocked by. I did not expect it to be used as much. I was literally on an interview with someone yesterday, and they were talking about how they used it in their own school there, and how they knew these other districts were using it. I've been kind of blown away and really humbled, honestly. It's been downloaded over 10,000 times, and we've seen several districts, several schools, and several states across the country use it to define HQIM in their spaces, whether referencing it and coming up with their own definitions or using it holistically. We've also learned so much since 2020, both externally from folks using it, from our own implementation of inquiry journeys, and just work we've continued to do in terms of honing our own understanding of what we believe high quality instructional materials need to do in the social studies space. And so we revised it earlier this year to really reflect our learnings from those folks as well as our own curricular learnings. And that's what we're going to dive into today. So I'm going to turn it to Elizabeth to take a look at the revised domains. She's just going to go pretty quickly through this, and then we're going to have a conversation about them. So Elizabeth, I'll keep screen sharing, but I'll take you to the first one.
Great. Thanks, Shanti. So first, a depth of knowledge and skill. We know this is important in social studies. Here, we're really talking about what students know and can do across all four disciplines of social studies. So it includes building factual understanding, knowledge like the three branches of government or the names of the continents, but also that deeper conceptual understanding, things like checks and balances or supply and demand, as well as the disciplinary thinking and skills of a social scientist, things like sourcing, corroboration, spatial reasoning, things like that. So we're thinking about all three of those layers, that substantive knowledge, that conceptual understanding, and then that disciplinary thinking and skill. Next, we have structured and coherent inquiry design. So, broadly speaking, we're thinking about relevant and compelling questions that drive learning about those social studies topics. And those topics are intentionally sequenced in curriculum to logically layer knowledge and skill over time. So, we don't have big gaps or redundancies. We're really thinking about that logical progression in curricular materials. And this supports schema development. So curriculum is going to support students to link facts, broader concepts, to get to those enduring understandings. I saw a lot in that in the chat. What are students doing in order to build this knowledge? How is curriculum supporting that in a sequential way? And sequencing questions and topics, that's not enough. We also want to think about the instruction within an investigation. So, how is curriculum explicitly building background knowledge and skill with increasing complexity and independence so that we're not leaving learning to chance here? It's not an inquiry is not a free for all. We say that a lot. We're increasing that complexity. We're increasing toward independent, authentic application and problem solving. And that intentional progression helps ensure that all students are successful. We want curriculum to support this and not leave it to the teacher to have to figure out. Now we have balanced representation in multiple perspectives. Here, we're really thinking about the responsibility that curriculum has, not just the teacher, to ensure that students get an accurate, nuanced picture of the past, as well as contemporary issues, that they have exposure to and understanding of different perspectives. We don't want curriculum to avoid complex topics, but we also don't want curriculum to present oversimplified narratives or to insert ideological positions. So we're thinking a lot about how materials need to be reviewed, how there needs to be a transparent process, and how different voices and perspectives can play a role in that. Next, literacy development. So this domain is all about helping students develop the literacy skills needed for rigorous social studies investigations and to be effective communicators. So we're looking for curriculum materials to provide more than just opportunities to read, write, speak, and listen. We're looking for instruction to support students in building those literacy skills, to evaluate sources, to comprehend those sources, to write, to communicate conclusions, and also to engage in discourse, again, in ways that build over time. And then finally, usability and educator support. What good are high quality instructional materials if the teacher doesn't use them, right? So we want to see well-written lessons that are easy to understand, easy to follow. They have a predictable structure. We are looking for actionable guidance for the differentiation and assessment, and embedded supports that let teachers focus on good teaching. What do they need to have in their toolbox that can be right at their fingertips? And we're not relying on external structures or leaving it to the teacher, again, to have to figure out. We also want to see a wider system of support, professional learning, so that teachers can not only use the curriculum, but they can deepen their understanding of practice as they're using it.
We're going to take a little bit of a different tact now. I mean, that was a really great, helpful overview, and we've seen the big picture. But if we dig deeper, I just want to ask both of you some questions and try to bring these domains to life a little bit in class, how they are appear in classrooms and in materials, and maybe a little bit more about the revision process itself. So, Elizabeth, I'll actually start with you because you obviously think a lot about designing for depth of knowledge and skills, that first domain. And one thing that I think that we all can agree on is that high quality instructional materials are not a single lesson or just a supplement. It is about building that knowledge and those skills over time. So I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of what that progression might look like, either within a grade or even more interestingly, like across grade levels. What might that progression of knowledge or skills, maybe some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Let's start with something like human environment interaction and spatial thinking. So in kindergarten, students come to school with, of course, their own lived experiences, which vary, but they may have very little other geographic knowledge about the world around them. So we're going to begin with their immediate world. What do they already know and where are they ready to begin? They're going to use super simple maps. They're going to distinguish between natural and human-made features. They're going to learn how different weather and seasons might impact daily life. Starting with these really familiar and concrete topics are going to lay a foundation for more complexity in grade 1. So we can build upon this with more concrete vocabulary, things like climate, landforms, bodies of water. We can begin to explore those in different locations, and that can help us understand what makes our own place unique. And then as they move on into the second grade, now students have a foundational understanding of how the environment shapes how humans live. So now we can apply and deepen that in a historical context. So that breadth and that depth of knowledge is growing. And students are going to learn in second grade, how does the land, how did it impact the development of communities long ago? How have humans modified the land to meet their needs? They can compare maps to understand change over time. In an economic unit focusing on production and exchange, we have the background knowledge now to explore things like resources in different parts of the world and how that might influence and connect to production and trade. And this is just going to continue as they move up in grades, right? So they're developing more sophisticated map reading skills. They're exploring different locations through these cross-cutting economic, historical, civic lenses. And the stronger that foundation is, the more you can layer on top of it. So the more they know, the more they can learn, and then the taller that pyramid gets, and the more depth they have there.
I wanna move on to the second domain, the structured and coherent inquiry design. But before I do that, here's a question. Inquiry and explicit instruction. When you think about inquiry in social studies, what role do you think explicit instruction, briefly defined, teacher-led explanations, modeling guided practice, should play? An important role, it's essential for building knowledge. A minimal role, inquiry should mostly be student-directed, or I'm not sure, I'm still figuring this out. Option to say both, please. Yes, I know there needs to be another button, but I want to make it hard to choose. Let's end the poll and I'll share the results. So an important role, it's essential for building knowledge, 50%. A minimal role, inquiry should be mostly student-directed. I'm not sure, still figuring this out. Shanti, I included this poll because one of the things that we included in this revision was a specific indicator that says that a high-quality instructional material sequences knowledge building through a research-backed progression that includes explicit instruction, guided practice, and student-driven exploration. So I would love to hear you talk a bit about the role of explicit instruction in inquiry, the relationship between that and knowledge building, and maybe the way, most people see them as opposed, and you really are trying to get people to see them as more integrated.
I think I'll actually answer this by going kind of back in a time machine here. So when we started Inquire Ed, we called it Inquire Ed. That's how much of a fan I am of inquiry. I was an inquiry-based teacher. I don't have a tattoo, but I might as well have a tattoo that says inquiry on it. And Elizabeth was also a teacher like that. Both of us have that as our backgrounds. And I don't think either of us totally realized the controversy that the word inquiry can bring sometimes to conversations. I don't think that we knew that totally. But in our 8 years since founding Inquire Ed, we just had our 8-year birthday, we learned a lot about that word and how it was being perceived and what that looks like. And we started to realize there's two things that are true at the same time here. One, inquiry is actually it can be used like a lot of terms as a catch-all term for a lot of things. And there are some examples of inquiry being done not very well, just truly not being done very well. Whether it's not really thinking about, are my students, like, what is the background knowledge of my students and where am I starting this work? If I'm expecting it to go straight to kind of student-led, that's expecting a lot of student knowledge and skills at that moment in time. and can really advantage highly resourced students often. And how does equity play a role in that, and what does that look like? And it can also lead to a lot of different learning outcomes. And we think about progression of learning and how do we ensure, what I'm doing in fourth grade is setting students up to what Elizabeth was talking about earlier in terms of what they're doing in fifth grade. And so really thinking about how that progression happens, both across a grade level, but also into the other grade levels and all those pieces of it. So we started thinking a lot about that. We also started to see this kind of like false dichotomy between this idea of like inquiry is over here on one side and then knowledge building is over here on another side. And I think we started to see this a lot because of knowledge building has become such a term in ELA. And so that these are two separate things. And Elizabeth and I and folks at Inquire, we're like, what? Like inquiry is a vessel for building knowledge. Like these aren't even apples to apples things, right? Like these are one is a vessel and knowledge is an output of that vessel, if that makes sense. And so we just like skills are, by the way. And so we kind of wanted to break that false dichotomy. Simultaneously, I think Elizabeth and I have done a lot, and the folks at Inquired, I should not say me, I should say that our curriculum design team has just become a lot more sophisticated over the last several years in terms of how we look at the research and how that's embedded into our design. I don't want to say that in the beginning we weren't looking at research. We were definitely looking at research, but we had a lot of classroom experience ourselves and kind of we're figuring some of that out. We've really tried to hone in our pencil, and there's just been a lot being done in the research space as well around how students build knowledge. How do they do that in a way that leads to near transfer, far, medium transfer, far transfer? Because at the end of the day, why do we care about knowledge building? Because we want them to be able to go do something with that knowledge outside the classroom, right? It's not about the test. Like, yes, the test matters because it gives us an assessment of what they know, but we want them to be able to go do something well beyond, whether it's the next grade level or years ahead. We want them to be able to do something with that and be able to apply that knowledge to a novel context. Like that's what we want for students. And so we've just done a lot of work to be able to really sharpen in our pencil and like, what is the research telling us about how students tell knowledge, how students build knowledge? And there are several things that are true. Students build knowledge based on their funds of knowledge, right? They come in, they're not vessels to be filled up. They come in with knowledge and they bring that into the classroom. And we as teachers, we as curriculum developers have to tap into those funds of knowledge. We have to figure out like how we're tapping into those to be able to engage them as learners. That what the research tells us is that we've got to engage them. The research tells us is that students don't learn things about his geography or historical thinking or any of those things, facts about history, through osmosis, right? Like that's not how it happens. And nor is that inquiry, is that there is a lot of explicit instruction. I'll finally get to your question that has to occur in order for students to be able to gain that knowledge. And that's not one-time thing. It's not linear, like you do explicit instruction and then you go to a novel context. Like you're often explicit instructing all the time. This happens in classrooms. I think what happened is we started to equate explicit instruction with the idea of direct instruction, kind of the sage on the stage idea. And those are actually different things. And sometimes direct instruction, by the way, is needed, right? So like a teacher doing a read aloud, a teacher like directing and thinking about what is this vocabulary? I used to be all the time at the front of my classroom with the chart and thinking about what are the things that we're like thinking about today. And also at the same time, collecting students' responses to that. Often explicit instruction is happening with student-led instruction. Like these two things aren't like these pulled apart things. But explicit instruction to us and what the research tells us is very much a valuable part of an inquiry-based model. It isn't inquiry versus explicit instruction. Is it a structured inquiry-based model that we believe is going to lead to knowledge building and is going to require some sort of explicit instruction? And that explicit instruction should be very intentional about the kind of schema you are trying to develop. Like, what are the conceptual understandings we want students to develop? So if we're just learning facts for the sake of facts, that's going to go away. Elizabeth always refers to the eggshell, right? Like that eggshell is just going to go away. But how do we get to those enduring understandings? It's about thinking about how do these facts relate to these facts? And then what's the larger concept that I'm trying to build that then is going to relate to some other concept when I come across it? Now I'm going to be able to understand it, right? People often talk about the baseball study in terms of knowledge building. Well, it's not just that you're going to be able to read the baseball study. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the baseball study tells us that if we know a lot about baseball, we're going to be able to read a more complex text about baseball. Well, it's not just that I'm going to be able to read a more complex text about baseball if I know about baseball. When I read something about cricket, if I know something about how a bat is used in a sport, that there's a ball thrown, that there are runners, those are things that I'm going to be able to relate into thinking about cricket when I read something about cricket. Now, am I going to be able to read as high level text about cricket as if I've never known anything about cricket? But I will be able to take what I know about baseball into that. And now that fund of knowledge is helping me access something about cricket. Now, when I go into a whole new schema of sports or just games in general, I'm using what I know about baseball and cricket as, oh, there are rules. Oh, there are different players. Oh, there's a winner, there's a loser. There's all of these things that I bring into any sort of game, whether it's another sport or something else, and I'm bringing that into that other space. So very much so, like that instruction is a part of that larger inquiry-based model, and it is incredibly important. Just as important as this to think about how we are thinking about applying that in a novel context, right? If we just stop short of that and we never ask students to say, how do we take our learning of what we've done here and apply it in that novel context, in that other game, in that other sport, in that other our own community and what we've learned, whether it's learning about our own about other communities and then applying that to our own community in that novel context, that knowledge and skills is not sticky either. That doesn't set students up for really taking into that other context. So I don't want to say that explicit instruction is more important than something else, but neither is any of these pieces. You can't build schema without not explicit instruction. You can't think about explicit instructing without engaging that learner. You can't engage that learner without thinking about their funds of knowledge. These are all interconnected things. And our job as curriculum designers, as teachers, as folks that are really doing this work, we have to think about that coherent design. And that's what we think was not fully there in this domain the first time we did it, saying the kind of inquiry-based learning. There's a lot of inquiry-based learning that's being said in the name of inquiry and in the name of student voice and choice, but not all of that learning is leading to the kinds of outcomes we need for students that are equitable and are transferable and are meaningful. And that's what we've really tried to hone in our pencil in is, what does the research tell us? What does our own practice tell us? What does our own experiences tell us that is going to lead towards that kind of meaningful and outcomes?
Great. Thanks, Shanti. You mentioned the word transfer in there several times. And Elizabeth, I just want to follow up with you because that was a word that wasn't in the original review guide. We talked about informed action, which I think is a form of transfer. So can you talk to us a little bit about the idea of transfer and how it connects, like what do we mean by it? What does it do for students? Shanti touched a little bit on it, and how it connects to that idea of informed action that is so prevalent in thinking about inquiry in a C3 type inquiry arc model.
Thanks, Martin. It's
Yep.
an important shift. When I'm thinking about transfer, I'm thinking about students taking what they've learned, the knowledge and skills that they've built, um, through an inquiry, ideally, and they're applying it in a new and a meaningful context, as Shanti said. It's one of the things that makes learning durable when students are applying their understanding to interpret a new problem, to make a decision together, to act in the world around them. That's what's going to make it sticky. That's what's going to make it really meaningful to them. Like, we can learn the rules of a game, but we have to get out there and play the game. We have to experience challenges in order to really become experts, right? This dovetails with the final dimension of the C3 framework. Absolutely, right? Taking informed action is called for there. And we're thinking about that for the purposes of impact, right? How can students impact the world around them, not just by taking action, but by taking informed action? And we want to really be explicit about what that is doing to serve the students' learning. It's serving the world, absolutely. And it's leading students, recognizing what they've learned that can help them respond thoughtfully, again, to problems in the world around them. So in this revision, we wanted to make that more explicit. It's transfer's not an add-on that could happen. It's an essential part of the design of the inquiry, and taking informed action is something that allows transfer to occur as part of the structure, again, of the curriculum.
So I love that. So and it has to be designed like it's something that you design into the learning experience, transfer at several stages, and it's not uh an informed action project for its own sake. It's because it is also deepening that learning. Um I want to move on now. I want to touch on, I just want to stop a little bit in each domain. So I want to move on to balance representation in multiple perspectives. Um, we're asking in that domain for materials to do a lot to help students navigate these complex topics and think critically. What can instructional materials do? How does that balance with the teacher in the classroom?
Yeah, definitely. I'll go back to referencing kind of that slide that I used at the beginning showing the impact of high quality instructional materials. And I think in the curriculum developer world, we all share that, that data like that with kind of this badge of honor, as if HQIM is this magic bullet, and it is not. It is a really important piece of the puzzle, but it is a piece of the puzzle. And we often talk about Inquire Ed that we don't want to say words like this curriculum is, will transform students' experiences. It's about partnering with teachers and district leadership and all these folks to be able to support them in doing the work that they do with students. Like, we can only go so far. Like, this is how far I go. And often I have to tell you, I miss being a classroom teacher because I could go so much further in my impact. And so like, we have to really realize the role that what curriculum can do and separate that from where we are supporting teachers and where what they're doing with students. So what can curriculum do? It can ensure diverse voices are included, right? We can really think about the representation of the sources within our curriculum. We can think about, are they leading? We can think about, where's their authorship coming from? We can think about providing diverse perspectives in those sources. So that's something that a curriculum can do. And by the way, is incredibly difficult. It is incredibly difficult work. The work around, this is another thing I had no idea when we started a curriculum company, that how much work would go into sourcing, just the work of sourcing. Finding sources, finding grade level appropriate sources in terms of reading level and kinds of content, then adding into that diverse authorship, then adding that to that, like, is there, like, how does that play? Like, we're thinking about this source versus the source that's coming before and how they all play together. Is that getting to the outcomes we want in terms of knowledge and standards? Oh my, sourcing is a whole thing. I shouldn't be talking about this. Elizabeth would talk about how much time we spend on sourcing and the rubrics that we have in terms of source like selection is just this never ending list. And so that's not easy work. That's something that we can take on as curriculum developers. And I think we can do it pretty well because we have lots of people thinking about it. We can provide structures for analysis and comparison, right? We can provide instructional routines that really support students in thinking about their own funds of knowledge, tapping into those. We can think about instructional routines that help them analyze those sources, that compare those sources, that help them think about finding evidence from those sources and backing up their conclusions with those sources. We can provide those kinds of instructional routines. We can model ways of engaging with differences, right? We can provide instructional practices of like, what does discussion look like when we have these differences in opinions, like things like that. We can provide teaching notes to teachers of like thinking about, there might be differences in this is a hard topic that you're going into. We can provide that kind of guidance for teachers. There's probably some other things that Elizabeth would say that the curriculum can do, but I'll stop there. But that's where teachers really come in, right? Teachers bring that human relational part of it, this contextual layer. And I got to tell you, like, so anybody who's taught will tell you, like, whenever they talk about AI bots taking over teaching, they're like, have you been in a second grade classroom and known how relational it is? And by the way, have you been in an 8th grade classroom and known how relational it is? It's about tapping into those students and understanding where they are and where they're coming from and what they might be bringing into the classroom that specific day, let alone, as a whole person and what that coming in and what their own experiences are. We can provide all sorts of diverse sources, but the mirrors and windows of our students are completely different based on the classroom. So there's so many things that teacher has to bring into. And I like to think of it as, I often say, what is the role of high quality instructional materials? my husband's a surgeon, and his job is not to create the scalpel. Somebody who knows how to develop a scalpel does that. His job is to wield that scalpel with precision and expertise and know that in this moment, this surgery isn't the same as this other surgery, that I got to think about it differently. And so I think high quality instructional materials are like, we want to take as much away from the burden from teachers so they have that, and that they can be thinking about in the moment, who are my students and how do I focus in on them and be able to take it that last a lot of miles. I'm not going to say it 1 mile. A lot of work that still needs to be done there.
Great, thanks. I want to acknowledge that we've got about 11 minutes left. So, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions at the end. And we have two more domains to talk about. And Elizabeth, I know that you all are thinking a lot about the integration of ELA and social studies. And in this version of the curriculum review guide, literacy got a whole domain, you know.
Yes.
But we're talking about a social studies curriculum review guide, Elizabeth. Like, why does literacy get a whole domain in a social studies curriculum review guide?
Yeah, well, literacy is important because real social studies is not about memorizing names, dates, and places, right? Rigorous social studies requires content literacy as well as disciplinary literacy. So in today's world, students need to be critical consumers of information. That means evaluating sources for credibility, understanding bias and point of view, recognizing that not all sources give us the same or even accurate information. That requires information literacy, media literacy, the ability to navigate different types of sources. Then understanding the information inside the source. We can't just have primary sources and secondary sources and give them to our students. They need literacy skills to comprehend the sources, to understand what they're reading or what they're hearing. And then in writing, we're not just asking students to summarize what they've read in a rigorous social studies program. The standards are calling for them to construct strong explanations, well-reasoned claims. That means teaching them how to select relevant evidence, how to organize their ideas, how to communicate their conclusions clearly in writing. That takes instruction, that takes support. And discourse takes skill. It's not just about providing opportunities for discussion. That's not enough. We need to build those speaking and listening skills so that we're supporting students to not just communicate their ideas clearly, but also to listen to others' points of views, and to be able to engage in civil discourse. It is a skill. It develops over time. It requires instruction. So we can think about how both of these areas are mutually beneficial to one another. Students need literacy to meet the demands of the standards in social studies and to truly engage with the content beyond just knowing some facts. And that deep knowledge then also helps them communicate, become stronger communicators. That deep knowledge, that thinking skill is going to help them, again, engage in that discourse, to write that strong claim. So they benefit each other. And I think the literacy skills, by not naming them explicitly, then we kind of fall short of being transparent that these are skills that live in the social studies classroom. They take time to develop. They don't happen on their own through osmosis. And social studies needs time in order to develop those skills, in order to meet the demands of the standards and to have a rigorous program.
You got an enthusiastic response from Nathan. Yes, absolutely. Social studies teachers are literacy leaders.
Absolutely.
Nathan, that might be our next Inquire Ed bumper sticker or sticker. That's great. And there's a conversation going on about bias and perspective, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, totally. I really appreciate, there was someone who said in the chat, I don't want to say their name incorrectly, Asleen, hopefully I didn't mess that up too much. Said bias is a term used in so many fields and not inherently harbor negativity, just an inclination or effect towards one entity. I think that's an important part of like thinking about what are we trying to say here? And if we look back at the actual domain, we have the words critical thinking without bias. Does the curriculum promote critical thinking while guiding students to engage respectfully with different viewpoints, use evidence-based reasoning, and navigate complex topics without ideological bias? I think what we're saying in that domain, and I think like there's probably something for us to think about in how we've worded that, is that it's not that anything that any source that we provide isn't going to have some sort of bias in it. Like there's no way to provide a curriculum with all sources that have zero bias in it. There's really a perspective, as this person is saying, could be used. We could use the word perspective, or we could use bias. It depends on how we're thinking about it. It brings that negative connotation. What I think we're talking about is how does that curriculum as a whole not have an ideological bias? How are not all of the sources moving students toward a foregone conclusion about that? That's what we want to think about. And so when we think about diversity of perspective and where those things are coming from, and how do we actually have students engage in the practice of thinking about the perspective or bias, whichever word we want to use, in that particular source. So whether it's a source that they might agree with, right? They might be coming in and say, listen, this is my perspective, but they're looking at that source critically and saying, oh, what is the particular bias of this particular author, the perspective this particular author's came versus that other source that I thought about. And that's a real balance beam, honestly. I got to say, like, that's so hard to do. I have so much respect for our curriculum designers because that is very hard to do. And it's very easy to go this way or that way and that. And I will say, even in our own curriculum, we don't always get it right. There are some places that I think we'd say like, oh, we might have went a little this way or we went a little this way. Very hard to do. And I appreciate the comments around this. It is very much a challenging thing to kind of like navigate that and think about what that is, but it's about the whole. It's not just any one puzzle piece that is going to allow us to think about how are we as a curriculum or as a teacher not saying, hey, here is the thing that you should be taking away from this particular perspective.
I just want to share one more time and kind of wrap up that I just shared the PDF of the review guide. There are the 5 key domains. It's available as that PDF, and in the email on Tuesday, I will share it in a Google Doc version. You can just make a copy, and you can adapt it and use it as you wish. We would love to hear, however, it's very nice when we hear about how people are using it. Sometimes when you're just on a call, they'll say, hey, we really found this helpful. So we really, really just encourage you to share it and use it. There's nothing that we're not precious about it. We just want it out there, and we want to have conversations about it. So Shanti and Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you talking about the curriculum review guide.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. What an engaged audience. So
Yeah, it
thank
was
you so
great,
much.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
And everybody, you're going to want to tune in for our next webinar, which is in November, and it's about implementing elementary social studies across the district. If we kind of short-sighted the usability and teacher support, we're going to really lean into it. What do teachers need to support them in implementation? What can district leaders do? We'll really lean into that a lot. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.